Let's take a look at what's going on at layer 4, the transport layer. At the transport layer, three primary things that we're concerned with are protocols that reside at the transport layer. We need to talk about windowing and also buffering. First of all, let's consider just a couple of protocols. There are multiple protocols that reside at this layer, by the way. However, our main focus in our studies, these days anyway, is focused on TCP/IP. And the suite of TCP/IP protocols contains a couple of primary protocols at the transport layer. They are TCP and UDP. TCP stands for Transmission Control Protocol, and UDP stands for User Datagram Protocol. And they're quite different. TCP is referred to as a reliable protocol. In other words, if I send you a segment and you receive it with TCP, you're going to send me an acknowledgement, so I have some assurance that you received what I sent you. However, with UDP, it's sort of fire and forget. I send you data, I send you a segment, however, you don't let me know that you received it. I just hope you received it. As a result, UDP is referred to as a connectionless protocol. There's no acknowledgement. You might wonder, why would we do such a thing? That sounds horrible. I'm not getting acknowledgements. Well, think about it. If I don't have to receive acknowledgments, I'm not having to wait for acknowledgments, and I'm not having to consume bandwidth to transport those acknowledgments. UDP has significantly lower overhead than TCP, and that's appropriate for some types of transmissions. For example, I teach a lot of voice over IP courses, and in the voice over IP courses, we talk about UDP being used to carry voice. Voice packets are carried via UDP. By the way, they're carried inside of another layer 4 protocol called RTP, the real-time transport protocol. There's an RTP payload containing the voice, and it gets encapsulated. It gets wrapped up in another layer 4 protocol. It gets wrapped up inside of UDP. And the reason I bring it up is, think about it. If I send a bunch of voice segments out on the network and one gets dropped, would it make sense to retransmit that segment? No, probably not. I don't want these things to arrive out of order. I don't want excessive delay. If I drop one, oh well, I hope it doesn't sound too bad, but we just need to keep sending the segments as fast as we can. And as a result, UDP, along with RTP, makes a great layer 4 choice for something like voice over IP. Next, let's consider windowing. In fact, let's talk about something called a sliding window. This is something that TCP supports. Let me give you a graphic of what's going on here. Let's imagine that we have a sender and a receiver, and we start out with a small window size. In other words, the number of segments that I'm going to send before I receive an acknowledgement is 1. I'm going to start off with a window size of 1. I'll send segment 1 to the receiver, and I wait. I wait to make sure that the receiver received it. How do I know? The receiver sends me an acknowledgement, and notice it's acknowledgement 2. That's saying I received segment 1. Now I'm acknowledging that, and I'm requesting segment 2. Now, here's what happens with a sliding window. The sender starts to think this transport medium might be fairly reliable. After all, I sent a segment, it got acknowledged. Let's push my luck a little bit. Let's double the window size. Let's set a window size of 2. Let's send 2 segments. And I do. I send segments number 2 and 3, and then I wait for an acknowledgement. And sure enough, I get one. The acknowledgement comes, and it's asking for segment number 4. Wow, this must be a great transport medium I'm on. Let's double the window size again. This time, let's bump up the window size to a 4, and let's send segments 4, 5, 6, and 7, and then I get an acknowledgement saying, okay, got them. Send me segment number 8. And this can continue up to a point. The current standard says the maximum number of bytes that we can send in a single window. I'm not talking about segments right here, but we're talking about the number of bytes that we can send within a window. It's currently over 2 billion. That's supported by the standard. That's a lot of bytes before we expect an acknowledgement. But do you see the advantage of this windowing approach? We're not terribly aggressive at the beginning. We're trying to minimize the number of retransmissions that we have to do, but as we build greater and greater confidence in the trustworthiness and the reliability of the medium, we send more. And the more we send, the less overhead we have and the less delay we have because we're spending less time awaiting an acknowledgement. The final thing we wanted to talk about at the transport layer was buffering. Imagine this. Let's say that we had a router, and on one of the router interfaces, we're connected to a company's LAN, a local area network. It's running at a very fast LAN speed. It's running at, let's say, a gigabit per second. But that router is sitting at the edge of the wide area network. It connects out to a service provider, and let's use a slow speed. Let's say we're connecting out to a service provider using a T1 circuit. A T1 runs at 1.544 megabits per second. Do you see the speed mismatch? We're coming into the router at 1,billion bits per second, and we're trying to leave at about 1.5 million bits per second. That's a serious oversubscription. It's easy to send more traffic into the router from the LAN than it's going to be able to transmit right now out to the wide area network. So what does the router do? Does it say, whoa, you're sending traffic way too fast, and just start dropping those packets? No, the router allocates some memory called a queue or a buffer. And in this buffer, the router is going to store up those excess packets in hopes that the bandwidth demand is going to die down. And when it does, when the WAN does have some available bandwidth, the router can take those segments out of the queue, out of the buffer, and send them on the wide area network. That's called buffering. And by the way, if you get into a study of quality of service, you're going to see that there is really a science to how this buffering, how this queuing works. We can set up some fairly granular rules to say, here is exactly how I want to empty my buffer. Maybe my higher priority traffic, such as voice or video or high priority data, maybe that traffic gets emptied first from the buffer. Maybe I give a certain bandwidth guarantee to various traffic types as I empty them from the buffer. That's a quality of service or a QoS topic. For now though, let's just understand what buffering is. It's a way for a router's outgoing interface, that we sometimes call the egress interface, to store up packets until there is enough bandwidth to transmit them out of that interface.